folks. Pull up a chair. I need to talk to you about something that happened this week that tells you everything about what happens when you govern through fear and division and loyalty tests, rather than through competence and coalition building and actual policy. About what happens when a president treats Congress as his personal kingdom rather than as a co-equal branch. About what happens when the temperature gets raised so high, when threats become so common, when working conditions become so toxic that even your own supporters start saying this isn't worth it anymore. House Republicans are fleeing, not just retiring at the end of their terms, not just choosing not to run again, fleeing, contemplating leaving early, getting so fed up with Trump's chaos that they're thinking about walking away midterm. 41 members have already announced they're calling it quits. More expected to follow. And it's not because the job doesn't pay well enough or because they got better offers. It's because working in Trump's Congress has become what Axios calls the worst good-paying job in America. And the most stunning part, the person leading the exodus, the person whose resignation has rattled colleagues and sparked this conversation, is Marjorie Taylor Greene. Marjorie Taylor Greene, the woman who was Trump's most loyal cheerleader, who defended him through everything, who pushed conspiracy theories on his behalf, who made MAGA her entire political identity. Even she is saying this isn't worth it anymore. Even she is saying Trump has betrayed the base. Even she is leaving. When Marjorie Taylor Greene thinks Trump has gone too far, when she's criticizing him for being co-opted by elites and the deep state and tech billionaires, when she's saying he promised to be an outsider but became an insider, when she's accusing him of sidelining Congress and governing as a dictator, you know something fundamental has shifted. You know the coalition is fracturing. You know that governing through fear and loyalty tests has costs that are finally becoming too high even for true believers to accept. Let me walk through what's happening, because understanding the specifics matters. Understanding why Republicans are fleeing matters. Understanding what Greene actually said and why it's so damaging matters. Understanding the broader pattern of dysfunction matters for grasping just how badly Trump's approach to governing is failing. Start with the numbers. 41 House Republicans have announced they're not running for re-election. That's massive. That's historically high. That's a sign of deep dysfunction. Members of Congress don't normally flee in such numbers. They run for re-election. They want to keep their positions. They value their seats. When 41 decide it's not worth it anymore, something is seriously wrong. And it's not just that they're retiring at the end of their terms. Some are contemplating leaving early, resigning before their terms end, walking away from positions they worked hard to win, from careers they've built, from power they've accumulated. That's how bad it's gotten. That's how toxic the environment has become. That members are thinking about just giving up midterm rather than enduring it until the next election. Representative Don Bacon told Axios he was so angry at Trump's proposed Russia-Ukraine peace plan that he thought about resigning early. Think about that. A sitting member of Congress, a Republican, was so outraged by Trump's foreign policy that he considered walking away immediately. Didn't just disagree, didn't just vote no. Got so angry he thought about leaving Congress entirely rather than being associated with what Trump was doing. That tells you about the temperature, about how extreme things have gotten, about how Trump's policies and approach are alienating even members of his own party to the point where they'd rather quit than continue serving under him. Representative Tim Burchett said threats have been a factor in members' decisions to leave, said it takes a toll on people, said the violence and intimidation are driving people out. Think about that. Members of Congress are leaving because they're being threatened, because serving has become dangerous, because the political environment Trump has created is so toxic, so violent, so threatening, that people with families and lives decide it's not worth the risk anymore. Representative Jared Golden and Marjorie Taylor Greene both cited the uptick in political violence as part of their decisions to leave. Both said the threats matter. The danger is real. The fear for themselves and their families is a factor in choosing to abandon positions they work to achieve. That's what Trump has created. An environment so hostile, so threatening, so dangerous that even his own supporters decide they'd rather leave than continue serving. That's not strength. That's not making America great. That's creating dysfunction so severe that the institution of Congress is struggling to function because members are fleeing. Now let me talk about Marjorie Taylor Greene specifically, because what she said, how she said it, why it matters, All of that is crucial for understanding why her departure is different from other Republicans who've left Trump's orbit. Previous Republicans who broke with Trump did so from a position of moderation or principle. They were the Mitt Romneys, the Liz Cheneys, the Adam Kinzingers, people who said Trump had gone too far, violated constitutional principles, threatened democracy. They criticized Trump from the perspective of traditional conservatism or constitutional fidelity. They represented the establishment wing of the party that Trump had always battled against. Greene is different. She's criticizing Trump from the MAGA position, from the populist base, from the perspective of true believers who thought Trump was going to drain the swamp and fight the establishment and represent ordinary Americans against elites. She's saying Trump promised to be an outsider but became an insider, promised to fight the deep state but got co-opted by it, promised to represent the base but instead parties with tech billionaires and Wall Street. That's devastating. That's a knife from inside the coalition. That's the base turning on Trump, not because he's too extreme, but because he's not extreme enough. Not because he went too far, but because he sold out. Not because he violated principles, but because he abandoned the populist mission that defined his movement. Listen to how Tim Miller, former GOP insider, explains the significance. Greene is basically saying she wanted to do work on behalf of the MAGA base that Trump promised to represent. But she couldn't do it because Congress was never in session, and because the elites within the party have succumbed to the influence game of Washington, to the deep state, to the tech elites. That's essentially her argument, that Trump has been co-opted by the very forces he promised to fight. Miller points out that populist MAGA supporters always criticized the uniparty in Washington, the idea that Democrats and Republicans might disagree on certain issues, but ultimately both serve the rich, the military-industrial complex, the corporations, not ordinary Americans. Well, now, Greene is saying that's Trump. He promised to be different, promised to be an outsider, promised to fight those institutions. But he's been co-opted by them and likes partying with them. She didn't use Trump's name explicitly, Miller notes, but the statement makes very clear what she's talking about. And that is powerful. That is very different from previous Republicans who separated from Trump, because she's coming at him from the place of his core base, his core strength. And if even 5 or 10% of the MAGA base agrees with her, that's crippling to Trump's power. That's the first time he would actually lose the people who powered his rise. That's the significance. That's why Greene's departure matters more than others, because she's not representing the establishment wing criticizing from outside the movement. She's representing the populist base criticizing from within, saying Trump betrayed them, sold out, became what he promised to fight against. That fractures the coalition in ways that establishment criticism never could. And Greene goes further, says Congress has been sidelined by Speaker Mike Johnson acting in full obedience to the White House, says the institution has been reduced to rubber stamping whatever Trump wants, says there's no independence, no deliberation, no actual legislative work, just loyalty tests and obedience, says that's not what she signed up for. Not what the base elected her to do. Not what Congress is supposed to be. Representative Victoria Spartz echoed Greene's sentiment, writing that she can't blame Greene for leaving this institution that has betrayed the American people. That's another Republican, saying Congress under Trump has failed, has betrayed its mission, has become something other than what it should be. This is the coalition fracturing. This is Trump's approach to governing, creating casualties even among his own supporters. This is what happens when you demand total loyalty, when you sideline Congress, when you govern through intimidation and threats, when you create an environment so toxic that even true believers decide it's not worth it anymore. Now, let me talk about what Axios calls the worst good-paying job in America, because that framing captures something important about what's happening to Congress under Trump. Members make $174,000 a year. That's good money by most standards. More than most Americans earn, enough to live comfortably, enough that the salary alone should make the position attractive. But it's not enough, not anymore. Not when the job comes with death threats, with violent intimidation, with loyalty tests, with constituents radicalized by Trump's rhetoric threatening violence against anyone who doesn't show sufficient allegiance, with an environment so toxic that members fear for their safety and their families' safety, with working conditions so dysfunctional that there's no actual legislating, just performative loyalty displays and rubber stamping Trump's demands. That's why it's the worst good-paying job. Because the compensation is decent, but the conditions are intolerable. The salary is fine, but the environment is toxic. The position should be prestigious, but it's become humiliating. The work should be meaningful, but it's become performative. The role should be powerful, but it's been sidelined by executive overreach. Members of Congress are supposed to legislate, to debate policy, to represent constituents, to provide oversight of the executive branch, to serve as a check on presidential power. That's the constitutional role. That's what the position is supposed to entail. That's what should make it rewarding despite the challenges. But under Trump, Congress doesn't do any of that. Doesn't legislate meaningfully because Trump governs by executive order and demands loyalty rather than debate. Doesn't provide oversight because oversight of Trump is treated as betrayal. Doesn't serve as a check on presidential power because Trump has cowed the Republican majority into submission. Just holds loyalty tests. Just punishes defectors. Just rubber stamps whatever Trump wants. That's not fulfilling work. That's not why people run for Congress. That's not what makes public service meaningful. That's being a prop in someone else's authoritarian performance. That's why members are fleeing. Not because the salary isn't high enough, but because the work has become meaningless and the environment has become intolerable. Let me talk about the threats and violence, because that's a crucial part of why members are leaving. Tim Burchett said threats have been a factor, said it takes a toll. Green cited the uptick in political violence. Golden mentioned it too. These aren't hypothetical concerns. These are real threats that members and their families face because of Trump's rhetoric and the movement he's built. Trump has cultivated a base that responds to his enemies with violence. We saw it on January 6th. We see it in threats against judges, prosecutors, election workers, anyone Trump identifies as an opponent. We see it in members of Congress receiving death threats for voting wrong, for questioning Trump, for showing insufficient loyalty. We see it in the climate of fear Trump deliberately creates to intimidate opposition, and that affects Republicans too. When Don Bacon considered resigning over Trump's Ukraine plan, he was presumably calculating whether publicly opposing Trump was worth the threats that would follow. When members cite violence as a factor in leaving, they're acknowledging that serving under Trump means living with danger, with threats, with fear that saying or doing the wrong thing could result in violence against them or their families. That's not normal. That's not acceptable. That's not how democracy is supposed to function. Members of Congress should be able to vote their conscience, represent their constituents, provide oversight without fearing for their safety. The fact that they can't, that threats are driving people out of Congress, that violence has become a factor in career decisions, that tells you how badly Trump has damaged American democracy. And Republicans are complicit in this. They've enabled Trump's rhetoric. They've defended his behavior. They've downplayed the threats. They've treated January 6th as somehow legitimate political discourse. They've pardoned the rioters. They've normalized the violence. And now they're surprised that the environment has become so toxic that even their own members want to leave. That's reaping what they've sown. That's discovering that the monster they created doesn't distinguish between enemies and insufficient allies. That's learning that governing through fear eventually consumes even those who thought they were on the winning side. I've been watching politics and markets for 80 years. I've seen a lot of political dysfunction. I've seen Congress struggle through difficult periods. I've seen partisan divides and legislative gridlock and institutional challenges. But I've never seen anything quite like this. Never seen 41 members of one party deciding within a single term that Congress isn't worth staying in. Never seen members citing violence and threats as reasons to leave. Never seen the most loyal supporters of a president turning on him for betraying the populist base. This is unprecedented dysfunction. This is institutional breakdown. This is what happens when a president treats Congress as his personal kingdom and governs through intimidation rather than through coalition building and persuasion. This is the cost of Trump's approach to power. And economically, this matters. Markets depend on institutional stability, on government that functions, on Congress that legislates, on checks and balances that work. When Congress becomes dysfunctional, when members flee because the environment is intolerable, When the legislative branch is reduced to rubber stamping executive demands, that's institutional instability. That's governance breakdown. That affects economic confidence in ways that compound over time. Investors don't need perfect government. They need predictable government. They need institutions that work well enough to make and enforce laws, to provide oversight, to serve as checks on executive power. When those institutions break down, when Congress becomes dysfunctional, when 41 members decide it's not worth staying, that signals instability. That raises questions about whether American governance can sustain itself. That affects long-term confidence in ways that show up in risk premiums and capital allocation decisions. Not immediately, not dramatically, but steadily, through the accumulated cost of institutional dysfunction, through reduced confidence that government can handle challenges, through uncertainty about whether the system still works, through all the ways that political instability becomes economic cost. That's what Trump's approach creates. That's the price of governing through fear and loyalty tests and intimidation. Not just political dysfunction, but economic costs that everyone pays. Through reduced institutional effectiveness, through instability that makes long-term planning harder, through breakdown of the very systems that make prosperity possible. Now, let me talk about what this means for Trump's power, because Green's criticism and the mass exodus of Republicans from Congress tell us something important about whether Trump's control is as absolute as it appears, whether his grip on the party is sustainable, whether the coalition he's built can survive the stresses he's imposing on it. The conventional wisdom has been that Trump completely dominates the Republican Party, that no one can challenge him, that even mild criticism is career suicide, that loyalty to Trump is the only thing that matters for Republican politicians. And there's truth to that. Trump has exercised remarkable control, has purged dissidents, has punished defectors, has maintained loyalty through fear. But Green's departure and criticism suggests limits, suggests that even MAGA loyalists have breaking points, suggests that governing through intimidation and loyalty tests eventually becomes intolerable even for true believers, suggests that there are costs to Trump's approach that eventually outweigh the benefits of staying loyal. And if 5 or 10% of the MAGA base agrees with Green, if populist supporters start believing Trump has sold out to elites, if the core coalition begins fracturing, that's devastating to Trump's power, because Trump's entire political strength comes from that base, from the populist movement that believes he's fighting for them against the establishment. Take that away, and what's left? Republican establishment that's never liked him, moderates who are appalled by him, a shrinking coalition that can't win elections. That's the risk Trump faces, not from establishment criticism, not from never Trump Republicans, but from his own base concluding he's betrayed them, that he's become what he promised to fight, that the outsider became an insider, that the populist became an elite. That's the criticism Green is making. That's the fracture that could actually damage Trump in ways establishment criticism never could. Now, I don't know how widespread Green's view is among the MAGA base. Don't know whether 5% or 10% or more share her assessment. Don't know whether this is an isolated complaint or the beginning of broader disillusionment. But I know that when your most loyal supporters start saying you've betrayed them, when they're leaving rather than continuing to serve you, when they're criticizing you for selling out the populist mission, that's a serious problem. That's the kind of erosion that can accelerate quickly once it starts. And I know that 41 Republicans leaving Congress signals deep dysfunction, signals that Trump's approach to governance is unsustainable, signals that even people who should benefit from his power are deciding the costs outweigh the benefits. That's not strength. That's institutional breakdown. That's the beginning of political collapse. Whether Trump recovers from this, whether he can rebuild the coalition, whether he can address the concerns Green raises, those are open questions. But the fact that questions are even arising, the fact that MAGA loyalists are fleeing and criticizing, the fact that Congress has become so dysfunctional that dozens of members are leaving, that tells you Trump's control is more fragile than it appears, that the costs of his approach are mounting, that governance through fear and intimidation has limits. That's what this moment reveals. That's what Green's departure signifies. That's what the exodus of 41 Republicans demonstrates. Not that Trump has lost power immediately, but that the foundations of his power are cracking, that the coalition is under stress, that the approach is unsustainable. That breakdown, once it starts, can accelerate quickly. And for those of us who care about democracy, who oppose Trump's authoritarianism, who want accountability and rule of law restored, that's important information. Not because Green is some ally or hero, she's not. She's been complicit in Trump's damage for years. But because fractures in the MAGA coalition create opportunities, create space for organizing, create possibilities for change that don't exist when the opposition is completely unified. That's what to watch. That's what matters. Not celebrating Green as somehow becoming reasonable, she hasn't, but recognizing that when the coalition fractures, when true believers become disillusioned, when members start fleeing, that creates political opportunities. That makes resistance more possible. That suggests Trump's control isn't as absolute or sustainable as it appeared. So Trump's house of cards is crumbling. 41 Republicans fleeing. Marjorie Taylor Greene criticizing him for betraying the base. Members citing violence and threats as reasons to leave. Congress reduced to dysfunction. The institution sidelined. The legislative branch rubber-stamping executive demands. The environment so toxic that even supporters decide it's not worth staying. That's not strength. That's breakdown. That's what happens when you govern through fear rather than through building coalitions, through intimidation rather than persuasion, through loyalty tests rather than actual policy, through creating enemies rather than solving problems. And the costs are mounting. Members leaving, coalition fracturing, base becoming disillusioned, institutions breaking down, economic confidence eroding. All the ways that Trump's approach to power creates damage that eventually becomes unsustainable. That's the story. That's what matters. That's what this week revealed. Not that Trump has lost power immediately, but that his power is cracking, that the approach is failing, that governance through fear has limits, that institutions can only take so much stress before breaking, that even loyal supporters eventually decide it's not worth it. That's Trump's legacy, not strength, not making America great, but dysfunction, breakdown, institutions damaged, members fleeing, coalition fracturing. Democracy stressed to its limits by someone who views power as something to dominate with rather than something to serve through. And the only question is whether the breakdown accelerates, whether the fractures spread, whether more members follow Greene's lead, whether the base follows her criticism, whether Trump's control proves as fragile as this week suggests it might be. Because if it does, if the coalition collapses, if institutions break, if members keep fleeing, then Trump's power evaporates, not through defeat by opposition, but through collapse from within, through the unsustainability of his own approach finally catching up with him. That's what to watch. That's what matters. That's what this week might represent. Not certainty of Trump's downfall, but evidence that downfall is possible, that the foundations are cracking, that the approach is unsustainable. That change might come not from external opposition, but from internal collapse, from the coalition fracturing, from members fleeing, from the costs finally becoming too high even for beneficiaries to accept. That's the story. That's the significance. That's why 41 Republicans leaving and Marjorie Taylor Greene criticizing Trump matters, not as victory, but as evidence that victory might be possible, that Trump's power isn't permanent, that the approach is failing, that democracy might survive this stress by Trump's coalition collapsing before democracy does. That's hope, not certainty, but hope based on evidence, on actual events, on real fractures in Trump's coalition, on genuine dysfunction in his governance, on costs mounting high enough that even supporters flee. That's worth recognizing, worth understanding, worth building on, because that's how change becomes possible, through fractures spreading, through costs mounting, through coalitions collapsing, through the unsustainability of authoritarianism finally catching up with the authoritarian.